brought in bondage to America from Africa, the Negro carried and passed on valuable knowledge and handcrafting techniques in the arts of weaving, basket making, wood carving, music, and metal forging. Slaves taught their descendants to make objects as pleasing to the eyes as they were useful to the hands. Highest-priced slaves were plantation foremen, who served as chief assistants to the plantation owners or general overseers. Considered trusted men of good judgment, these slaves needed intimidating body builds to keep other slaves in line and working hard. Each day began with a foreman blowing his horn to summon fellow slaves to work. African rice coast slaves were highly valued for their extensive knowledge of growing rice. South Carolina's marshy areas contained major rice fields, and owning slaves who knew how to craft and operate rice tools was a great advantage. Banner baskets for winnowing rice and the mortar and pestle were used just as they were in Africa. Cotton was king, and by 1860, 3/4 of all Negro agricultural workers toiled in the cotton industry. Slaves also worked in the South's growing tobacco and sugar industries. House slaves generally had better food, clothing, and living quarters than the other slaves. Their positions, butler, seamstress, cook, etc., in a house would often be passed down to sons and daughters. House slaves looked down on other slaves, and even whites who were not of good class. They also took pride in the wealth of their owners. Emmeline was a house slave purchased in 1841 by William T. Montgomery. She became a valued member of the household who tended to 14 Montgomery children. Emmeline was then cared for by those children until her death in 1936 at 109 years old. The plantation kitchen provided plenty of work for both men and women. Besides cooking, kitchen help had to craft pots, dippers, spoons, and mortar and pestles. Humble and tedious though most of these tasks may seem to us today, the Afro-American slave brought to them that same pride of craftsmanship and creative power that had characterized his African ancestor. And, as President Leopold Senghor of Senegal has said, this is the original trademark of art. Slaves, skilled as weavers and spinsters, commanded high prices on the slave market. On some plantations, slaves were responsible for nearly all the textiles, weaving cloth for their masters and themselves. They spun and wove cotton, wool, linen, and even silk. They stitched piecework quilts, appliqué quilts, and woven coverlets. With fine attention to detail, they produced elegant dresses featuring intricate embroidery and laces. Skilled slave craftsmen ranked just below the house slaves in the plantation pecking order. The carpenters who built the homes with beams, mantles, and moldings claimed just as much importance as the blacksmiths who supplied the carpenters with their tools, nails, hinges, screws, locks, and keys. Slaves built the furniture for their own slave cabins as well as for the plantation porches and gardens. Cornelius Sutton Sr., a slave on Mulberry Plantation in Camden, South Carolina, was born with a club foot. He was taught the art of chair making because he could craft while sitting down. He straddled a special workbench and used a draw blade to fashion his chairs, which always featured twisted and woven corn shuck seats. It was also very common to use corn shucks for making floor mats. Nearly all slaves were black, but not all blacks were slaves. In North Carolina, the talented and highly successful cabinet maker Thomas Day, 1801 to 1859, was a free black who had in his service both black and white, slave and free. His beautiful furniture was featured in many fine homes, including David S. Reed, the governor of North Carolina, from 1851 to 1854. Most potters were slave men, since they possessed the necessary strength to turn the heavy potter's wheel and mold the clay. Slave women would often decorate the pottery. Dave was a famous slave potter known for making large pots with wide mouths and slab handles. He would sometimes sign or write a verse on his pots, a nearly unheard of practice since it was unlawful for slaves to learn to read or write. Blacksmithing was a trade which showcased some of the best of African American artistry. Ornamental ironwork was produced in great quantities in Charleston, Savannah, Mobile, and New Orleans. Peter Simmons was a slave blacksmith who designed and made intricate wrought ironwork in the Charleston area. The Riley Foundry, also located in Charleston, employed an ex-slave as their chief pattern maker for cast iron work. This trade required a wooden pattern to be crafted and placed in wet sand to form a mold into which molten iron would be poured. Most all foundry workers in the South were African American. Identification tags were required to be worn by every slave in Charleston, South Carolina. Tag numbers were registered to the slave owners, and new tags were issued each year. It was a form of taxation, and the tag prices depended upon the occupations of the slaves. Free blacks living in the South were required to carry certificates of freedom, or could be treated as runaways. During the Civil War, blacks offered to serve in the army, but were turned away due to fears of incompetency. As the war dragged on, more manpower was required, and old beliefs became less important in the face of crushing need. Blacks became active participants behind the scenes and on the battlefields, distinguishing themselves in the Civil War. Slavery was abolished by the passage of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution in 1865. Deep spiritual beliefs gave hope and comfort to slaves and free African Americans facing years of difficult times. Inspiring Negro spirituals lifted hearts through song, while traditional customs and practices kept people grounded in faith. Many African American religious customs and music are deeply rooted in Mother Africa, including the American banjo, which is a direct adaptation of the banjo brought from Africa. A culture of making do. Even after emancipation and throughout the period of Reconstruction, African Americans primarily worked in agriculture, domestic services, or trades such as carpentry, shoemaking, blacksmithing, etc. This harsh economic reality created an innovative culture of making do. As fine art painters and sculptors, African Americans began to distinguish themselves during the 19th century. Still, racial bias and prejudice actually caused some painters to become expatriates. In 1943, in an effort to encourage aspiring African American artists, Professor James Herring and Alonzo Aden of Howard University opened the Barnett-Aden Gallery in Washington, D.C. Contemporary African American artisans continue to be inspired by the old traditions. Basket makers have the freedom to move beyond the utilitarian designs and create true showpieces. The woodcarver, as in Africa, adorns his walking sticks primarily with animal and human figures. Recycled materials, such as matchsticks, are turned into artistic masterpieces reminiscent of a culture of making do.